Hi there, my name is Chloe, and before I get started, I would like to apologize for being a little bit sick. I'm sure you will all be able to hear it in my voice, and I will do my best not to demonstrate that to you throughout the video and try and keep it together. However, today I will be bringing forth awareness to rape myth acceptance, which is probably a new term for most of you, and victim blaming, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. Unfortunately, this seems to be perpetual in many societies. However, in this video, I will specifically be focusing on our society and our culture within America and some of the attitudes and behaviors that accompany rape myth acceptance. Later, I will outline some of the ways in which victim blaming is applied to other forms of oppression as well. To begin with rape culture in America. We see that many college campuses are plagued with accounts of rape and victim blaming, as well as the hookup culture that we see happening in recent generations. And victim blaming and rape is often the result of those sort of cultures. Rape is also often overlooked with the excuse of rape myth acceptance. A rape myth can be defined as a false belief used mainly to shift the blame of the rape from the perpetrator onto the victim themselves. And with this, we can observe many adverse effects from these false beliefs that not only harm society as a whole, but also the individual who becomes the victim. One, it can protect sexual predators. Two, invites a greater possibility for more crime without accountability. It increases the difficulty for justice to be served. It directly contributes to the misogynistic attitudes and behaviors. And 5, blaming the victim often results in the victim blaming themselves rather than the perpetrator. Now, to return our attention to the second effect that I mentioned, rape myth acceptance directly contributes to the pervasiveness of rape. I would like to take a second to really stress to you guys the significance of this effect. Without accountability of individuals, we are easily able to justify these actions with rape myth acceptance attitudes. Rape myth acceptance and oppressive beliefs can be associated with hostile attitudes and behaviors directed towards women. And by this, I generally mean misogynistic attitudes that I discussed a little bit earlier on. And if society had the control to shift the blame back onto the perpetrator rather than the victim, there's a good chance we'd see a fall in these attitudes and behaviors and maybe in the incidence of rape as well. And to no surprise, men are more likely than women to endorse rape myth acceptance. But also keep in mind, I mentioned earlier that women who have become victims often hold some degree of self-blame rather than blaming the perpetrator themselves, which, needless to say, has an immense psychological effect on the victim. We can also observe that there is a high correlation with other isms such as classism, heterosexism, ageism, and even racism. And of course, it is not limited to just these few. You can find many aspects of society where we as a whole find a scapegoat or blame the victim rather than owning up to and acknowledging our own faults. Now, I'd like to shift focus from victim blaming in rape culture towards victim blaming and other forms of oppression within our society. Police brutality, for one, is now a pressing issue in America specifically. We clearly see this with our attention turned to the Ferguson protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. However, right wings in this country shift the blame from the police force onto the victims. In this case, those who have been killed and those who are protesting the killings are the victims. The protesters are portrayed through the media to be rioting and using excessive violence, and there's a heavy focus on their ethnicity when it really has no ties to the incidents that are unfolding. In a more specific case, you take Mike Brown. His character was portrayed through the media to be a thug who deserved to die, and the police officer's actions are usually defended or even justified. When high accounts for police brutality, these individuals are African American and they are unarmed, and still the police force finds some way to justify or defend their actions and make excuses to deem their excessive force as necessary. The bottom line really is that there is no police officer that reserves the right to execute someone on the spot for any reason. Again, I'd like to draw us back to this misogynistic attitudes and behaviors behind rape culture that I mentioned earlier in the first segment, and relate that to the racist and sexist attitudes, classist attitudes and behaviors behind police brutality. We can also observe the same kind of oppression and use of victim blaming in other aspects of society aside from rape culture and police brutality. For example, I'd like to draw our attention back to last week's course material, and we watched that short segment on the series Transparent. If you can recall, you have the father who is also a transgender woman. She and her daughters attempt to use a public restroom that she deemed fit for her sexual identity or her gender identity. Better phrase, gender identity. In result, she is subjected to harsh comments and stigmatization and criticism from the other women in the restroom. At this point in history, society has failed to recognize that refusing transgender individuals access to proper restrooms is discriminatory. Reinforcing cruel policies such as this one denies dignity to some of the most vulnerable people in society, directly subjecting them to even more stigmatization than that they already face. When we accept this view, we blame the transgender individual for being who they are or how they are, when we should be focusing on creating a more accepting attitude as a society as a whole. The blame is then put on the individual, enforcing the stigmatization rather than the transgender individual themselves. Unfortunately, this is all too common for transgendered individuals. When we see this play out in real life, it often results in violence. As we saw mentioned in some of the readings that you can witness a transgender woman being dragged from the bathroom by other women when they don't feel that it's right for her to be using that restroom. It opens the transgender individual up to threats that a cis individual would not have. Conservatives tend to sympathize with the other women and claim that this presents harm and danger to the women and children who are biologically required to use that restroom. This issue enforces a sort of shame and stigmatization, as I mentioned already, onto the transgender individual and allows for a perpetual application of negative attitudes and oppressions, when we should actually be reevaluating our attitudes and behaviors in order to readjust to the perspective that it assigns blame to the victims. By bringing forth awareness, we as a society are able to acknowledge the attitudes that blame the victim are unacceptable. We can also begin to hold perpetrators accountable for their attitudes and behaviors, and hopefully begin to see a decline in some of these incidents that I have mentioned here in this video. And that is all I have for you guys today, and thank you for watching.